36 years ago, a group of prodigious 8-year-old pianists vanished without a trace on the night of their most anticipated performance. They were the best in the world, trained to perfection, each wearing identical blue ribbons in their hair. Alongside them, their elderly mentor disappeared as well, leaving behind a mystery that haunted the town for decades. No leads, no explanations, just silence. Now, more than 3 decades later, a sick and aging mother receives a single blue ribbon, stained and frayed, along with a cryptic message that changes everything. Secrets buried for too long begin to resurface. People who had long forgotten the past suddenly remember more than they should. And an unspeakable truth begins to take shape, a truth that was never meant to be uncovered. What really happened to those children? And why, after all these years, has the past returned to knock on her door? Some mysteries refuse to stay buried, and some melodies are never meant to be played again. If you're ready for an emotional and unforgettable journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret Evans sat in her small, dimly lit kitchen, the ticking of the old wall clock echoing against the silence of her empty home. The house had been lifeless for years, just like her heart. The once vibrant walls now carried the weight of memories, faded and cracked like the life she had lost. She stirred a cup of tea she barely intended to drink, the spoon clinking against the porcelain in rhythmic motions, a habit rather than a necessity. Outside, the autumn wind howled, pushing against the windows, as if trying to whisper secrets long forgotten. Her hands, now wrinkled and frail, trembled slightly as she reached for the pile of unopened mail. Most were bills, medical statements, or charity requests she could no longer afford to answer. But then, among the stack, something caught her eye. A small, pale envelope with no return address. Her name was scrawled across it in shaky, almost hesitant handwriting. A chill ran through her spine as she carefully opened it. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, only a single blue ribbon, old and stained, tied in the same perfect bow she had once tied in her son's hair every morning before school. Her breath hitched, her fingers clenched around the delicate fabric, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was impossible. Couldn't be. David, she whispered, her voice breaking. Memories flooded her mind. Memories she had buried deep within herself. The image of her son, bright-eyed and eager, sitting at the piano, his small fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The sound of his laughter, the way he would play the same melody over and over again, as if it spoke to him in a way no words ever could. And the last time she ever saw him, on that fateful evening, standing beside his classmates, dressed in their matching blue ribbons, walking toward the grand theater where they were meant to perform. And then, nothing. No answers. No traces. Just an unexplainable silence that swallowed them whole. Her hands shook violently as she turned the ribbon over, only to find something written on it. A message, barely legible, written in what looked like faded ink. They still play. You need to listen. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She staggered back, knocking the chair over in the process. The room spun around her. For years, she had tried to let go. She had tried to believe the stories people told her, that the children must have been taken, that there was no hope, that she should move on. But how could she? How could any mother move on when her child had simply vanished as if he had never existed? Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the ribbon to her chest. Who had sent this? Why now? What did it mean? She needed answers. Margaret grabbed her coat, barely feeling the weight of it as she stepped outside into the cold night. The wind bit at her skin, but she hardly noticed. She needed to go back to where it all began. The town had changed in 36 years. The once lively streets were now filled with unfamiliar faces, new businesses, and different cars. But some places remained the same, and one of them was the old theater. It loomed at the end of the street, abandoned for decades, its grand structure now weathered by time. The marquee was shattered, its letters missing, as if trying to erase the memory of what had once happened there. The doors, though chained shut, seemed to whisper an invitation, as if something inside was waiting. Margaret took a deep breath and placed a trembling hand against the cold surface of the wood. And then, she heard it. A faint melody came from within the theater. Soft, delicate, almost hesitant, as if someone was playing with hands too small for the keys. Her heart nearly stopped. It was the same song. The song David had been practicing for weeks before he disappeared. Margaret staggered back, her breathing uneven. This wasn't possible. The theater had been abandoned for decades. No one had set foot inside since that night. And yet something was playing. She turned around, ready to flee, when a movement at the corner of her vision made her stop. A shadow, small, childlike, standing beneath the flickering street lamp. Margaret's throat tightened. The figure stood still, unmoving. She couldn't see a face, only a silhouette. And yet, something deep inside her told her she knew who it was. David? Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted a hand and pointed. Margaret followed the direction of the small hand. Her eyes landed on an alley beside the theater. A place she had never paid attention to before. A place that had always been just a dark corner of the past. She turned back to the figure, but it was gone. Margaret felt her body tremble. She should leave. She should turn back and pretend she never saw any of this. But she couldn't. She had already spent 36 years running from the past. Slowly, she walked toward the alley. The air felt heavier with each step, as if she were wading through something unseen. And then she saw it. A single, small door hidden behind vines and rubble. Rusted, old, yet slightly ajar. Margaret hesitated. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool metal handle. A deep breath, a silent prayer, and then she pushed the door open. Darkness, a long corridor, damp and forgotten. And at the end of it, something flickered. A candlelight. A figure sat inside, hunched over a table. Papers, photographs, and something else. Something small and delicate, laid spread across the surface. Margaret stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath her. The figure lifted their head. And when their eyes met, Margaret's world shattered. It was a face she hadn't seen in 36 years. A face she thought she would never see again. The man's lips trembled as he stared at her, as if seeing a ghost. His eyes were filled with something. Fear, regret, desperation. "Margaret," he breathed, his voice barely audible. Her knees nearly buckled. She had spent years searching for answers. Years believing that no one knew the truth. But standing in front of her, with the same haunted eyes that mirrored her own, was the one person she had trusted more than anyone in the world. Her brother, the only other person who had been there the night of the disappearance. Margaret's fingers clenched around the ribbon in her hand, her voice breaking as she spoke the only words that mattered. "You knew." The man swallowed hard, his face as pale as the candlelight that flickered between them. Margaret's heart pounded, realization crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The answers had never been lost. The truth had never been unreachable. It had been here all along, hidden, buried, kept from her. And now it was time to uncover it. Margaret's breath came in short, uneven bursts as she stared at the man before her. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines of age and the burden of a past neither of them had dared to confront. She gripped the blue ribbon tighter in her trembling hands, the fabric worn and fragile, just like the memories she had tried so hard to forget. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She had spent 36 years drowning in silence, believing she was alone in her grief. But now, standing here in the dim glow of a forgotten past, she realized she had never been alone at all. How long? Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the force of every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every moment of silent suffering she had endured. "How long have you known?" The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked older than she remembered, his once thick hair now thinning and streaked with gray. His shoulders hunched as if the years had weighed him down more than they should have. His hands, resting on the table before him, were calloused and rough, gripping the edge of a yellowed newspaper, one of the many spread across the wooden surface. The headline was faded but unmistakable: Mysterious Disappearance of Young Pianists Still Unsolved After 36 Years. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. Her brother, Nathan, looked at her then, his eyes dark and haunted. "I never wanted you to find out," he admitted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I thought, if I kept it buried, if I let it fade into the past, maybe it would all disappear. Maybe you could move on." "Move on?" Margaret let out a sharp, bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to her own ears. "You knew what happened to them, Nathan, to David, to all those children, and you let me suffer. You let me believe they were just gone." His face twisted with pain, as if her words had physically struck him. "It wasn't that simple." "Then make it simple." Her voice rose, cracking with desperation. "Tell me the truth." Nathan hesitated. His fingers drummed anxiously against the wooden table before he exhaled deeply, lowering his gaze. "The night they disappeared," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was there." Margaret's stomach twisted. "What? I was there?" he repeated, his hands curling into fists. "I saw them go inside the theater. I saw the professor lead them backstage, promising them that this would be the performance of a lifetime. And then," he trailed off, his expression darkening. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. "And then what?" Nathan's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he reached across the table and picked up something she hadn't noticed before. Cassette tape. Margaret frowned. "What is that?" He hesitated before pressing the small plastic object into her palm. "It's a recording," he said, "of that night." She stared at it, disbelief washing over her. "How do you have this?" Nathan ran a hand over his face, looking as if he were unraveling before her eyes. "I took it," he admitted. "Back then I was working part-time at the theater, helping with the stage setup. The professor asked me to check the recording equipment to make sure everything was in place for the performance. I left the tape running. I wasn't supposed to, but I forgot to turn it off." Margaret's fingers curled around the cassette, her heart hammering. "So you heard what happened?" Nathan nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Not everything. The tape cut off at some point. But what I did hear, Margaret, it wasn't normal. Something happened to those kids. Something unnatural." A shiver crawled down her spine. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if the words themselves carried too much weight. "There was music," he murmured, "but it wasn't just them playing. It was something else. Something, I can't explain it. The moment they started their final piece, the recording changed. The melody became distorted, almost like something else had joined in. And then there were voices, whispering, crying. And the last thing I heard before the tape cut off." He swallowed hard. Margaret leaned in, barely breathing. "What?" Nathan lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. "They were calling for help," he whispered. "But they weren't alone." The candle flickered violently, casting erratic shadows along the walls. A chill settled deep in Margaret's bones, the weight of Nathan's words pressing against her chest. For years, she had imagined every possible scenario. Kidnapping, conspiracy, an accident that had been covered up. But this was something different, something far more terrifying. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice wavered. Nathan closed his eyes briefly, his expression one of deep regret. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't understand what I had heard, and when I went back to the theater the next morning, everything was gone. No instruments, no signs of the children. The police said there was no evidence of foul play. It was like they had never been there. I didn't know what to believe. And then, a week later, I received a letter." Margaret's breath hitched. "A letter?" Nathan nodded and reached into a worn leather satchel beside him. He pulled out an aged, yellowed envelope and handed it to her. "It was left on my doorstep. No sender. Just a single page inside." Margaret unfolded the brittle paper, her eyes scanning the familiar scrawl. Forget them. Forget what you heard. If you don't, the music will never stop. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the letter. Nathan, she breathed, looking up at him. Who wrote this? His jaw clenched. I don't know, but whoever it was, they meant it. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. Margaret clenched the cassette in her hand. I need to hear it, she said firmly. Nathan hesitated. Margaret, I don't think. I need to hear it. Her voice was steel. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine, but not here. There's an old tape deck in my shop. We'll listen to it there. Margaret nodded, tucking the cassette into her coat pocket. As they stepped outside, the air felt colder than before. The streetlights flickered above them, casting eerie glows along the cracked pavement. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself as they walked. But just as they reached the main road, something made her stop. A sound, a melody, soft, haunting, drifting through the night air like a whisper from the past. She turned sharply, searching for the source. But the street was empty. Nathan must have noticed her hesitation because he placed a hand on her shoulder. Margaret, she barely heard him. Her pulse pounded in her ears, because she knew that melody. She had heard it before. It was the song David had played, and someone somewhere was playing it again. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the melody drifted through the night air, faint yet unmistakable. The same song, the same chilling, sorrowful notes her son had once played over and over again, as if the music itself had a hold on him. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkened streets, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for what she was hearing. But there was nothing. No open windows, no street performers, no radios playing in the distance. Just the wind and that haunting, unbroken melody. Nathan followed her gaze, his expression tightening as he listened. Margaret, he said cautiously, placing a firm hand on her arm. We need to go. She barely registered his words. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her hands clenched into fists. The music wasn't just a memory. It was here. Someone was playing it, or something. Her legs moved before she could stop herself. She stepped off the curb, following the invisible thread of sound pulling her forward. Margaret! Nathan called after her, his footsteps quick behind her as she turned the corner, her eyes darting wildly between the closed storefronts and abandoned alleyways. And then, the music stopped, abrupt, as if the world itself had swallowed the sound. Margaret halted mid-step, the sudden silence pressing in on her like a weight. Her breath came fast and shallow. The absence of the melody was almost more unsettling than the music itself. Nathan caught up to her, gripping her shoulders. Margaret, stop. You don't know what you're chasing. She shook her head, her throat dry. I know that song, Nathan. I know it. And someone was playing it. He exhaled sharply, glancing around them. It could have been anything. Coincidence. A radio somewhere. No, she interrupted. Not a coincidence. Not after this. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the blue ribbon, holding it between them. Someone sent me this. Someone wants me to remember. And now I'm hearing his song. Nathan ran a hand over his face, frustration evident in the tension of his jaw. Margaret, please. This isn't. A sound cut him off. A single note, sharp, piercing, coming from behind them. Margaret turned so quickly that the world spun around her. There, across the street, standing just outside the entrance of an old bookstore, was a figure. Small, still, a child. Her breath hitched. The figure stood motionless beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, its face hidden in shadow. But Margaret didn't need to see the features to feel the familiar, gut-wrenching pull deep in her chest. The child lifted a hand slowly and pointed. Nathan cursed under his breath. Margaret, don't. But she was already moving. She stepped off the curb, crossing the empty street, her heartbeat hammering so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. The child didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't breathe. Margaret stopped just a few feet away, her lips trembling. David! The figure's head tilted slightly at the name. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Margaret gasped, her eyes darting wildly, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No shadow stretching across the pavement. Nothing. As if the child had never been there at all. Nathan reached her side, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." Margaret felt frozen in place. Her body trembled. Her knees threatened to give out beneath her. "You saw him," she whispered. "Tell me you saw him." Nathan hesitated. "I saw something. But Margaret, tell me you saw him," she demanded, her voice breaking. Nathan swallowed hard. "We need to get to the shop. We'll listen to the tape. We'll figure this out." Margaret let out a shaky breath, nodding despite the gnawing unease in her chest. They walked in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Nathan's shop was only a few blocks away, a small, cluttered space filled with old antiques and forgotten trinkets. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of dust and aged paper. Nathan locked the door behind them before flipping on the overhead light. "Come on." He led her to the back of the shop, where an old wooden counter was cluttered with various relics of the past. Among them sat an ancient tape deck, the kind most people had long forgotten. Margaret hesitated only a moment before pulling the cassette from her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she slid it into place. Nathan exhaled. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" She met his gaze, steel in her eyes. "I need to." He nodded, pressing play. First, there was nothing. Just the static hum of old tape, the faint crackle of time preserved in plastic. And then, the first few notes of the song. Margaret's entire body went rigid. The melody was soft at first, delicate, the sound of small fingers pressing carefully against ivory keys. She knew those notes. She knew that touch. Her son, David. She pressed a hand against her mouth, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Then came the voices, soft at first, barely a whisper beneath the music, and then louder, crying. Margaret's breath hitched. Nathan stiffened beside her. "Do you hear that?" Margaret could only nod. The crying grew, became desperate. A child's voice, distant, almost distorted. "Please." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Help us." And then, the distortion grew. The music faltered. A deep, echoing hum filled the space between notes. Presence. Something else in the recording. A voice. Not a child's. Not human. They still play. The tape cut off. Silence. Margaret sat frozen, the weight of what she had just heard sinking into her bones. Nathan's hands trembled as he reached for the cassette, ejecting it from the deck as if it burned to the touch. Margaret turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're still there." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Margaret, we don't know what that was. We don't even know if..." "They're still there," she repeated, her hands shaking as she gripped the ribbon tighter. Nathan exhaled sharply. "Even if they are, I have to go back," she interrupted. Nathan's head snapped toward her. "Margaret, no." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with something unshakable. "I lost him once, Nathan. I won't lose him again." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "You don't know what you're walking into." "I don't care," he cursed under his breath. "Then I'm coming with you." Margaret hesitated before nodding. "We leave at dawn." The old theater waited, and the music had never stopped. The night felt endless. Margaret sat in the dimly lit corner of Nathan's shop, her hands wrapped tightly around the blue ribbon, as if letting go would make everything disappear. The weight of the cassette tape's recording lingered in the air like an unspoken truth, suffocating and undeniable. "They still play." The words from the recording echoed in her mind, intertwining with the desperate voices of the children, their cries a haunting reminder of what had been stolen from her. Nathan paced the room, rubbing his face, his exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Margaret, think about this," he muttered, shaking his head. "If this is real, if they're still there, what are we supposed to do?" Walk into that theater and demand they come back. Margaret's gaze snapped up, her voice unwavering. If that's what it takes. Nathan let out a sharp breath. And what if it's not them anymore? A shiver crawled up Margaret's spine, but she refused to acknowledge it. I don't care. I have to know. Nathan dragged a hand through his graying hair, muttering something under his breath before finally sitting across from her. His eyes, tired and heavy, met hers. I'll go with you. Margaret had expected resistance, had braced herself for another argument. But there was none, just reluctant acceptance. Thank you. Nathan exhaled, leaning back against the chair. We leave at dawn. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay on the worn couch in the back of the shop, staring at the ceiling, her mind tangled in memories of David, his laughter, his tiny fingers pressing against the piano keys, the way he used to hum to himself when he thought no one was listening. And then, the last time she ever saw him, standing with his classmates, their blue ribbons neatly tied, their young faces filled with excitement. She should have been there that night. She should have never let him go. The first light of morning crept through the window, casting pale streaks of gold against the dust-covered furniture. Nathan stirred from his chair with a groggy groan, rubbing his face before glancing at Margaret. Still sure about this? Margaret stood, slipping the ribbon into her coat pocket. More than ever, the drive to the theater was silent. The town was still waking, the streets empty, the air thick with the dampness of morning dew. Margaret gripped the edges of her coat, her heart pounding against her ribs as they approached the place that had haunted her for decades. The theater stood as it always had, abandoned, forgotten by time. The once grand entrance was now crumbling, the marquee letters long gone, the windows covered in grime. It was a monument to an event no one wanted to remember. Nathan killed the engine, gripping the steering wheel tightly before sighing. Last chance to turn around. Margaret pushed open the door before he could say anything else. They crossed the street, the pavement cracked beneath their feet. The heavy chains that had once sealed the doors shut were gone. Margaret frowned. Someone's been here. Nathan tested the handle, turned with ease. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Margaret hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The air was thick, stagnant, carrying the scent of dust and forgotten years. The faint echo of their footsteps bounced off the cavernous space as they moved deeper into the theater's lobby. The chandeliers that had once shone with golden light now hung lifeless, their crystals coated in grime. The faded posters on the walls, advertising performances from decades past, peeled at the edges. Margaret swallowed hard as she stepped forward, her pulse quickening with each echoing step. The theater was just as she remembered, yet somehow different. The silence wasn't just emptiness, it was watching. Nathan moved beside her, his voice hushed. Where do we start? Margaret's gaze drifted toward the stage, the place where everything had changed. There. They walked down the central aisle, past rows of seats covered in dust and decay. The stage loomed ahead, dark and waiting. Margaret hesitated at the edge before slowly stepping up onto the wooden platform. The moment her foot touched the floorboards, a soft creak echoed through the room. And then, music. Faint, distant. Margaret's breath hitched. Nathan stiffened beside her. Do you hear that? She nodded, her heart hammering. The melody was fragile, like a whisper floating through time, the same song she had heard in the night. Margaret turned toward the grand piano that sat at the center of the stage. It was pristine, untouched by dust or time, as if someone had been playing it all along. A chill ran through her. Nathan, she whispered. What? She swallowed, her voice barely audible. There's someone sitting there. Nathan turned sharply, his body tensing. And there, in front of the piano, sat a child. His small frame was hunched over the keys, his fingers hovering just above the ivory surface. His dark hair fell in soft waves over his forehead, a blue ribbon tied neatly at the base of his neck. Margaret's entire world stopped. Her voice trembled as she took a single step forward. David! The boy didn't move. Nathan grabbed her arm. "Margaret, wait!" But she broke free, stepping closer, her hands shaking. "David, it's me. It's Mom." The boy's fingers twitched, and then, slowly, he turned his head. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. His face was the same round cheeks, the same bright eyes, the same innocence frozen in time. But his eyes, they weren't looking at her. They were looking through her. Empty, lost, trapped. Margaret felt something inside her crack. "David!" His lips parted slightly, as if trying to speak. But no words came, only a single sound. A note, soft, fragile, the first key of the song. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears as the melody began again. His small fingers pressing against the keys in perfect rhythm, just as he had done all those years ago. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. "David, stop." He didn't. The music continued, each note weaving through the empty theater like a thread of something unseen. Margaret reached for him, her fingers brushing against his shoulder. And the moment she touched him, everything shattered. The theater around her dissolved into darkness. The walls trembled, the air crackled, and suddenly, she was no longer standing in the theater at all. She was somewhere else, somewhere before. The music swelled, and the past opened its doors. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the world around her shifted, dissolving into something unrecognizable. The theater faded, its walls crumbling into darkness, and for a terrifying moment, she felt as if she were falling, pulled into something far deeper than memory, far stronger than time. The notes of the piano swirled around her, growing louder, consuming her. The song, it was endless. It was alive. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping onto anything real, her own breath, the rapid pounding of her heart. But when she opened them again, she was no longer standing on the stage, no longer in the abandoned theater. She was there, 36 years ago. The air smelled different, warm, rich with the scent of fresh wood polish and velvet curtains. The chandelier above her sparkled, its golden glow illuminating a grand theater, pristine and full of life. People filled the seats, their murmurs a soft, expectant hum. The night of the performance, the night David disappeared. Margaret gasped, stepping back in shock. The floor beneath her was solid, but everything else felt weightless, unreal, like a half-remembered dream. She turned, searching desperately for something, someone, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. And then, she saw them, the children, dressed in their matching uniforms, their blue ribbons neatly tied, standing in a line at the edge of the stage. Their faces were bright with anticipation, their hands folded patiently as the audience settled in their seats. Margaret's heart clenched. David was there, her son, 8 years old, standing among his classmates, his small hands twitching in nervous excitement, his gaze flickering toward the grand piano at the center of the stage. She took a step forward, barely breathing. "David!" she called. No reaction. None of the children turned. None of them seemed to hear her. Margaret's pulse quickened. She tried again, louder this time. "David, look at me." But the moment the words left her lips, a sharp, electric hum crackled through the air, cutting her off. The sound made her head spin, her ears ring. She stumbled, clutching the side of the stage as the lights above flickered. And then, she saw him, at the far end of the stage, standing near the heavy crimson curtains. A figure watched. The professor. His silver hair was slicked back, his suit pressed to perfection. His hands were clasped behind his back, his gaze locked onto the children. There was something unnatural about the way he stood. Too still, too controlled, as if he were waiting for something. Margaret's skin prickled. She knew this man, had seen his picture in the newspapers in old articles about the disappearance. But something about him was wrong. He turned, just slightly, and for the briefest second, Margaret swore his eyes met hers. A slow, knowing smile curled at the edge of his lips. A chill ran down her spine. The murmurs of the audience faded as the professor stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden stage. He raised a hand. The children straightened. Margaret's breath hitched. The performance was about to begin. The professor's voice rang through the theater, smooth and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome." His smile remained perfectly intact as he gestured toward the children. "Tonight, these young prodigies will grace you with something truly special, a composition never before played in public. A piece written long ago, hidden for centuries, until now." Margaret's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. None of this was right. She watched in horror as the professor turned to the children, his voice dropping to something softer, yet commanding. "Begin." The children moved as one, taking their seats at their assigned pianos, their fingers poised above the keys. Margaret felt her body tense, every instinct screaming at her to stop this. But before she could move, the first note struck, a deep, resonant chord that vibrated through her bones. The second note followed, then the third, and then the melody, the same haunting tune, the song that had never ended. Margaret's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. The music wrapped around her, thick and suffocating, like unseen hands pressing against her chest. The children played with precision, their fingers moving in perfect unison, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before. But something was wrong. The air around them began to shift. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The audience remained frozen, their expressions blank, their eyes wide but unseeing. And then the whispers began, low at first, beneath the music, just a soft murmur beneath the growing melody. Margaret's heart pounded. She turned wildly, searching for the source, but the whispers were everywhere, rising, surrounding. Then, the children's hands faltered. Margaret's pulse stopped. David's fingers hovered above the keys, trembling. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, and then he turned. For the first time, he saw her. Margaret's throat tightened. "David!" His lips parted, his eyes wide with something. Fear, desperation, recognition. "Mom!" A deafening crack split through the air. The lights exploded. The walls trembled. The theater collapsed. Margaret was falling, plunging back into the darkness, the sound of her son's voice the only thing she could hear. And then, silence. Cold, still, empty. She gasped, her lungs burning as she shot upright. She was back. The abandoned theater. The present. The dust-filled air pressing against her skin. Nathan's frantic voice filled her ears. "Margaret! Jesus, are you? What the hell just happened?" She blinked rapidly, her chest heaving. I was there." Nathan grabbed her shoulders. "What are you talking about?" Margaret turned to the grand piano. It was empty. David was gone. The ribbon in her hand was wet, with something dark, something ancient. Margaret's fingers trembled. Nathan followed her gaze, his expression turning pale. "Margaret, what is that?" She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not over." The theater was waiting, and the past had never let go. Margaret sat frozen on the stage floor, her fingers gripping the wet ribbon, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The world around her felt distant, unreal. The dust-filled air of the abandoned theater pressed in on her. But she wasn't here. She was still there, in the past, with them, with him, David, his eyes, his voice calling out to her. The weight of what she had seen, what she had lived, pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a memory. It was real. She had been there. She had seen the performance begin. She had seen the terror in David's face when he looked at her. Nathan knelt beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Margaret, look at me." Her head snapped toward him, but she barely saw his face. Her vision was still clouded by the past, by the flickering candlelight of the grand theater, by the children sitting at their pianos, their fingers hovering over the keys as the whispers surrounded them. Nathan's face was tight with concern, his voice edged with fear. "Tell me what just happened." Margaret swallowed, forcing herself to focus, to pull herself back to the present. "I was there," she whispered. "I saw them." Nathan frowned. "Saw who?" "The children." Her voice broke as she gripped his arm. "David. He was there. He saw me, Nathan." Nathan hesitated, glancing around the empty theater as if expecting something, or someone, to appear from the shadows. "Margaret, you passed out. You were standing 1 second and the next you collapsed. You weren't anywhere." Margaret shook her head violently. No, I was there. I felt it. I smelled the wood polish, the velvet curtains. I saw the audience. I saw him." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the professor standing at the edge of the stage, his cold smile, his watchful gaze. They started playing. And then something happened. Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't possible." Margaret forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. And yet, it happened. She turned toward the piano, half expecting to see David still sitting there, his fingers resting on the keys. But the bench was empty. The silence in the theater was suffocating. The ribbon in her hands felt heavier, damp and cold, as if it had been touched by something beyond time itself. Nathan followed her gaze, his jaw tight. "What do we do now?" Margaret swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the ribbon. "We finish this." Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Margaret, I need to go back." Her voice was steel. Nathan's eyes widened. "Are you insane? You just passed out." "I didn't pass out." She turned to him, her expression unshakable. "I went back. Someone pulled me there. And if I could see them, if I could see David, then that means there's still a way to reach him." Nathan let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "Margaret, listen to yourself. You're talking about walking into the past. That's not how time works." She took a step closer to him. "Then explain this." She held up the ribbon, the dampness of it sending a shiver through her fingers. "Explain why it's wet, Nathan. Why does it feel like it's been pulled through time? Why did I hear their voices on that recording? Why did I hear David calling for me?" Nathan hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. He had no answer. Margaret's hands trembled, but her resolve remained unshaken. "I lost him once. I'm not losing him again." Nathan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Say you do go back. Say this is real. What happens then? You change the past? What if you can't? What if you get stuck? Or worse, what if you weren't supposed to see this?" Margaret's stomach twisted at the thought, but she didn't let the fear take hold. "I don't care." Nathan stared at her, his expression torn between disbelief and something deeper, something like understanding. After a long silence, he sighed. "How do we do this?" Margaret turned back to the piano, her fingers brushing against the polished wood. "The song," she murmured. "It's the key." Nathan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Margaret traced the outline of the keys, her heartbeat steady. "It started when they played, and it started when David played. If the music pulled me there once, maybe it can do it again." Nathan's eyes darkened with unease. "You want to play it?" She nodded. "It's the only way." Nathan hesitated, then let out a low, defeated chuckle. "This is insane." Margaret glanced at him. "Then why are you still here?" Nathan sighed, shaking his head. "Because you're my sister, and if you're going to do something stupid, I might as well be here to witness it." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding before turning back to the piano. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang through the empty theater, soft but clear. It vibrated through her bones, sending a chill up her spine. The second note followed, then the third. Margaret's breath came slow and measured as she played, her fingers remembering the melody instinctively. The song David had played, the song that had never ended. Nathan stood beside her, watching in silence. And then, the air shifted, the lights above flickered, the world around her bent. Margaret gasped as the stage beneath her feet rippled like water, the weight of time folding in on itself. A deep hum filled the theater, a sound that didn't belong in the present, a sound that was pulling her under. Her vision blurred. The walls melted. The past reached for her. And this time, she didn't resist. The theater roared to life. Margaret's breath caught as she found herself standing not in the abandoned ruins, but in the grandeur of a forgotten night. The chandeliers blazed above, the polished floors gleamed, and the air buzzed with excitement. She had done it. She was back. The seats were filled with an audience unaware of the storm about to unfold. The children stood at their pianos, their blue ribbons catching the light. And there, at the center of it all, David. Margaret's heart clenched. He was right there. But before she could move, before she could call out to him, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She turned, gasping. The professor stood before her, his cold smile unwavering. His grip was firm, unrelenting. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. Margaret's pulse stopped. The music swelled around her. The past had trapped her. And now, she had to find a way out. Margaret's breath hitched as the professor's fingers dug into her shoulder, cold and firm, as if he were made of something other than flesh and bone. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, his gaze unwavering as it locked onto hers. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured again, his voice deceptively gentle. Margaret swallowed hard, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The opulent glow of the chandeliers above cast flickering light across his face, making the deep lines in his skin look even sharper, his eyes darker, like endless wells that held secrets no one should ever uncover. She wrenched her arm free from his grip, stepping back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" The professor smiled, a slow, calculated thing that sent a chill crawling down her spine. "You already know the answer to that." Margaret clenched her fists. "No, I don't. And I don't think you do either. Because none of this is real, is it?" She glanced around, at the grand theater, at the audience frozen in their seats, their faces eerily still, their expressions vacant, their eyes staring straight ahead without blinking. She turned back to him. "What is this?" The professor tilted his head, his amusement unwavering. "A performance, of course." Margaret's stomach twisted. Behind her, the children shifted in their seats, their small fingers resting lightly on the keys of the grand pianos before them. The air vibrated with anticipation. The stage wanted them to begin. The past was a script waiting to be followed, and Margaret was standing in the middle of it, refusing to play her part. But she wasn't here to watch. She wasn't here to remember. She was here to change it. Margaret squared her shoulders, her voice firm. "I want my son." The professor's smile widened, but there was something dangerous behind it. "Do you?" Her heart pounded. "Where is he?" The professor let out a quiet chuckle, almost pitying. "He's right there." He gestured toward the children. "Where he has always been." Margaret's eyes darted to the row of small figures seated at the pianos. And there, at the far end, his hands resting on the keys, his shoulders tense. David. Margaret's breath caught. It was him. It was really him. She took a shaky step forward, but the professor moved faster, blocking her path with a slow, deliberate step. Margaret glared at him. "Move." The professor's head tilted again, as if studying her. "You don't understand, do you?" His voice was laced with something unreadable, something almost sad. Margaret's patience snapped. "Then make me understand." The professor exhaled, long and slow. And then, with the ease of a conductor raising his baton, he lifted his hand. The children's fingers moved. The first note rang out, clear and bright. Margaret's chest tightened. "No," she whispered. The second note followed. Then the third. The melody filled the air, wrapping around them like an unseen force, pressing against her skin, sinking into her bones. Margaret's pulse spiked. She turned sharply toward David, her voice rising. "David, stop playing." He didn't react. None of them did. Margaret rushed forward, but an unseen force slammed into her, stopping her in her tracks. It wasn't a hand. It wasn't something she could see. It was the music itself. She gasped, trying to push against it, but the melody only grew louder, stronger. It wasn't just sound. It was something more, something alive. The professor sighed. "You can't stop it." Margaret turned on him, rage burning in her chest. "Watch me." The professor only shook his head. They belonged to the song now. Margaret's entire body went rigid. "What?" His gaze darkened. "This is not just music. It's not just a performance. It's a binding, a contract." His voice lowered, almost a whisper. "A price." Margaret's stomach turned. She looked back at the children, at David. His fingers moved with precision, but his eyes were distant, unfocused, as if something had hollowed him out and left only a shell behind. Margaret's throat tightened. "David," she tried again, her voice cracking. "Baby, I'm here. Look at me." For a fraction of a second, his fingers faltered. The music wavered. Margaret's breath hitched. Then, a snap. Not a sound. Not a physical thing. But something broke. The air shifted. The theater shuddered. And suddenly, every single child on that stage turned their heads toward her at once. Margaret stumbled back. Their eyes. Oh God, their eyes weren't empty anymore. They were pleading. Margaret's chest clenched so tightly she could barely breathe. The professor's voice was soft, almost regretful. "They don't want to play anymore." Margaret spun to face him. "Then let them go." The professor's expression darkened. "It's not that simple." The music swelled, chaotic now, twisting into something unrecognizable. The chandeliers flickered wildly, the audience still frozen in place, unmoving, unaffected. The air around them rippled, the very fabric of the theater unraveling at the seams. Margaret fought against the force pressing against her, stepping closer to the professor, her voice filled with fury. "Then tell me how. How do I stop this?" The professor regarded her for a long moment before finally speaking. "The song is incomplete." Margaret's breath came fast and shallow. "What?" The professor turned his gaze toward the children. "They've been playing it for years, decades, but they have never played the last note." Margaret's mind spun. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because the last note seals it." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She turned to David, her voice shaking. "David, don't play it." David's fingers trembled. The final note was waiting. One last sound, one last moment, and everything would be lost. Margaret lunged forward, pushing against the invisible weight crushing her, reaching for him. "David!" And then, his hands froze, his breath hitched, his fingers hovered, and he stopped. The music collapsed. The theater shook. The chandeliers above burst, raining shards of glass down in slow, shimmering spirals. The seats of the audience vanished, swallowed by the darkness beneath them. The stage itself cracked, splintering like fragile porcelain. Margaret grabbed David, pulling him into her arms, feeling the warmth of him, the realness of him. "I've got you," she whispered, pressing a hand against the back of his head. "I've got you." David's small hands gripped her coat. "Mom!" Tears burned Margaret's eyes. "I'm here. I'm right here." The professor's voice was distant now, fading with the collapsing theater. "You broke the cycle." Margaret looked up, her breath shaking. He was disappearing, fading, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that almost looked like relief. The theater crumbled around them, the past unspooling like an old film reel, erasing itself, piece by piece. And then, silence, a cold wind. Margaret opened her eyes. She was kneeling in the abandoned theater. The real one. David was in her arms, alive, breathing, and the music was finally gone. Margaret clutched David to her chest, her breath ragged, her entire body trembling. The silence around them was deafening. No more whispers, no more music, no more unseen force pressing against her ribs, making it impossible to breathe. Just stillness, just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. David was in her arms, solid, real. His small frame was warm against her, his fingers grasping at the fabric of her coat, as if he, too, needed proof that she was real. that this wasn't just another trick, another nightmare in the endless performance. She squeezed her eyes shut, a sob building in her throat. "I've got you," she whispered again, over and over, like a prayer. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." His small voice trembled against her shoulder. "Mom!" Margaret pulled back just enough to see his face. His eyes, those same brown eyes she had memorized, the ones that had haunted her dreams for 36 years, blinked up at her, dazed and filled with something fragile, something lost. Her fingers trembled as she cupped his cheek. "David," she choked. "You're here." He swallowed hard, his lip quivering. I was playing, and then His small hands curled into fists, his breath hitching. "I didn't want to anymore, but he said we had to." Margaret's heart clenched. "The professor." David's tiny nod was almost imperceptible. Margaret's grip on him tightened. "He's gone now," she whispered, brushing his hair back, feeling the warmth of his skin, the weight of him in her arms. "You're safe." David's breath came in short bursts. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Margaret pressed a kiss to his forehead, her tears dampening his hair. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered. "Not for a single day." A sharp intake of breath made Margaret turn. Nathan. He was standing at the edge of the stage, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. His gaze was locked on David, his expression twisted in something between shock and disbelief. He took a hesitant step forward. "Is that?" Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Nathan's breath came out in a shudder. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply, as if trying to ground himself in reality. "Jesus," he murmured. "Jesus, Margaret." He crouched down beside them, his voice softer now, careful. "Hey, kid," he said, forcing a smile. "You gave us one hell of a scare." David blinked up at him, his small face still unsure, still caught somewhere between fear and recognition. Margaret's voice was gentle. "David, this is your Uncle Nathan." David hesitated, as if pulling at something buried deep within him. His lips parted slightly, his brows furrowing. And then, "Uncle Nathan?" His voice was small, uncertain. Nathan let out a breathless chuckle, nodding. "Yeah, kid, it's me." David's tiny fingers curled into the fabric of Margaret's sleeve. "I remember you." His voice was so quiet, so young. "But you were different." Margaret swallowed hard. To David, it had only been a moment, a blink. To them, it had been a lifetime. Nathan's expression flickered with something raw. He reached out slowly, carefully, placing a hand on David's back. "Yeah, well," he said gruffly, clearing his throat. "I got old. But you." He forced another chuckle, though it was thick with emotion. "You didn't age a day, huh?" David shook his head, his small face scrunching in confusion. "Why?" Nathan hesitated, glancing at Margaret, his jaw tight. Margaret pressed a hand against David's cheek, her voice soft. "Because time forgot you, sweetheart," she murmured. "But I didn't." David's eyes filled with something she couldn't bear to see. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Margaret wiped it away. She wrapped her arms around him again, holding him close, rocking him gently, as if making up for all the nights he had been lost, alone, trapped in a song that had never been meant to be played. Nathan exhaled sharply beside them. "We need to go," he said, his voice lower now, more urgent. Margaret nodded, knowing he was right. The theater was collapsing. Not physically, not in a way the world would see, but Margaret felt it. The energy, the weight of it, fading, unraveling, dissipating like a dream waking from itself. The contract was broken, the music was gone, and the past was finally letting go. Margaret stood, still holding David close, his arms wrapped around her neck. Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. The seats were gone. The chandeliers above had long since fallen into dust. The grand stage was nothing but rotting wood and broken memories. As they stepped outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling gold across the empty street. David blinked against the brightness, pressing his face against Margaret's shoulder, his small hands gripping her coat. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "We need to get him somewhere safe." Margaret nodded. "Home." Nathan hesitated. "Do you think?" He glanced down at David. "Does he have one?" Margaret looked at her son, her throat tightening. She wasn't sure how this worked. She wasn't sure why it had worked. But David was here, and she would never let him go again. She pressed a kiss to his hair. "He does now." Nathan nodded, stepping ahead to start the car. Margaret held David close, watching the last remnants of the theater behind them, the forgotten place where time had stood still. And then, a shift, a flicker. For just a moment, she swore she saw something. A figure, standing in the doorway of the crumbling theater. Watching, Margaret's breath caught. It was him, the professor. But there was no malice in his gaze now. No cold, calculated smile. Only silence. And something else. Something that almost looked like acceptance. Margaret stared at him, her pulse quickening. He held her gaze for only a moment longer. Then, he was gone. The wind whispered through the empty streets. Margaret exhaled, tightening her hold on David. It was over. But deep inside her, she knew the past never truly disappeared. It only waited. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Nathan's car, David curled up against her, his small hands gripping her coat even in sleep. The rhythm of the road hummed beneath them, a steady pulse against the silence that had settled over them since they left the theater. Nathan's hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. His jaw set, his gaze locked straight ahead as if he were afraid that if he looked back, the past might still be there, waiting to pull them under again. Margaret ran her fingers gently through David's hair, her mind spinning with the weight of it all. He was here, after 36 years of silence, 36 years of unanswered questions, of mourning without a body to bury, of fighting against the ache of a mother's grief. He was here. But how? And more terrifyingly, what now? He hadn't aged. His body was still that of an 8-year-old boy, but something in his eyes was different. There was a weight there, an exhaustion that didn't belong to a child. He had been trapped in something beyond time itself. He had lived in a melody, in an endless performance that had kept him frozen, repeating the same song over and over for decades. And now, suddenly, he was here, in a world that had moved on without him. Margaret swallowed hard. How was she supposed to explain this to him? What would she tell him when he woke up and realized everything he had ever known was gone? Nathan let out a slow exhale, breaking the silence. "We should go to my place first," he muttered. "Figure things out before you take him home." Margaret's chest tightened at the word. Home. What even was that anymore? The house where she had raised David. The house filled with the echoes of his laughter, of his music. It was gone. Sold years ago. Her life had become a series of empty rooms and unanswered prayers. And now, suddenly, she had him back. But at what cost? Nathan glanced at her, his voice softer now. "Margaret." She blinked, realizing she had been staring blankly at the window, the passing landscape nothing more than a blur. Nathan sighed. "We need to think this through." Margaret's fingers tightened in David's hair. "What's there to think about?" Nathan scoffed. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that the kid hasn't aged a day since 1989? Maybe the fact that, to the world, he's been dead for 36 years. He shook his head, gripping the wheel. "We can't just walk into town with him like nothing happened." Margaret's stomach twisted. She hated that he was right. David was a miracle, a second chance she never thought she would get. But he was also an impossible thing. And impossible things had consequences. She looked down at him, his face peaceful in sleep, his small fingers still holding onto her like she might disappear if he let go. Her heart ached. "He's my son, Nathan," she murmured. "I don't care what anyone else thinks." Nathan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know, but we have to be careful." Margaret closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat. She was so tired. "Just a few days," Nathan said. "Let's get our heads straight. figure out what we're dealing with. Then we'll decide what to do next." Margaret didn't respond. She just held David closer. She didn't care what they had to do. She didn't care what the world thought. She had him back, and she was never letting him go again. Nathan's house was small and cluttered, filled with relics of the past. Old newspapers stacked against the walls, antique furniture covered in dust, shelves overflowing with books that no one had touched in years. It smelled like wood and old memories, like something left behind by time itself. Margaret carried David inside, his small body warm against her as she laid him gently on the couch. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. His tiny fingers twitched as if still playing the piano in his dreams. Margaret's chest ached. Nathan poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the table to her before sinking into the chair opposite her. She ignored the drink. "What do we do now?" Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "We don't rush. We don't panic. We think." Margaret exhaled sharply. "I don't have time to think, Nathan. I have a child who just came back from—" She hesitated, shaking her head. "I don't even know where." Nathan took a sip of his drink, his eyes dark. "You think he remembers?" Margaret swallowed. "I think he remembers everything." Nathan leaned back, his gaze flickering toward David. "Then we need to be prepared." Margaret's breath caught. "For what?" Nathan hesitated. "Then, for what happens when he realizes he doesn't belong here." Margaret's blood ran cold. She shook her head. "Don't say that." Nathan sighed. "I'm not saying we send him back. I'm saying we need to know what we're dealing with. He was trapped, Margaret, frozen in time. We don't know why he's back. We don't know what that means." Margaret's chest tightened. "He's my son." Nathan's voice was gentle, but firm. "And he's not just a little boy anymore." Margaret turned sharply, her voice breaking. "Yes, he is." Nathan sighed again, dragging a hand through his hair. "Margaret!" A small noise made them both stop. A whisper, soft, fragile. Margaret turned immediately, her heart racing. David was awake. He was sitting up, his small frame tense, his brown eyes flickering between them, filled with something she couldn't name. He was listening. Margaret's breath caught. "David!" His voice was quiet. "Where am I?" Margaret moved to his side immediately, brushing his hair back. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're with me." David swallowed, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar space. "Where's my room?" Margaret's chest tightened. Nathan cleared his throat. "Hey, kiddo. We're at my place for a bit. Just resting." David frowned slightly. His small fingers gripped the fabric of his sleeves. "I don't understand." Margaret forced a smile. "It's okay. I'll explain everything." David looked at her, searching her face. "Is the show over?" Margaret felt her entire body go still. She exchanged a glance with Nathan, who went rigid beside her. Her hands trembled as she cupped David's face. "What did you say?" David's small voice was barely a whisper. "The show," he repeated. "Did we finish it?" Margaret's throat tightened. "David, there is no show anymore." David blinked slowly. His breath quickened. His fingers twitched. Margaret's stomach twisted. "David?" she whispered. His small hands clenched. And then, the lights flickered. A single note hummed through the air. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. The song. Margaret's breath stopped. Nathan shot to his feet. "Tell me you heard that." Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped David's shoulders. "David, look at me." His breathing was uneven. His hands shook. He lifted his wide, terrified eyes to hers, and whispered, "I think the music is still playing." The room went cold. Margaret's pulse thundered. It wasn't over. Not yet. Margaret's breath caught as David's whispered words settled into the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. "I think the music is still playing." The air grew heavier, colder. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was waiting. The faint echo of a single note still vibrated in the air, so soft it was almost imperceptible, like the dying hum of a string that had been plucked but never allowed to fade completely. Nathan swore under his breath. running a hand through his hair as he turned away, pacing the length of the room. No, no, this isn't possible. We ended it. We ended it. Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around David's small shoulders. His skin was warm, but he was trembling. His eyes, wide, fearful, darted around the room, searching for something unseen. David, she murmured, forcing her voice to be gentle even as her chest tightened with panic. Sweetheart, tell me what you mean. You hear something? David nodded slowly, his hands gripping his sleeves. It's not loud. It's like a hum, like it's coming from far away. His voice wavered. But it's still there. Margaret's stomach twisted painfully. What does it sound like? David's breath hitched. The last note. A shiver ran through her. Nathan stopped pacing, his face pale, his jaw tight. Are you saying the song never ended? David hesitated, his fingers twitching. I don't know. It's like... He bit his lip, struggling for words. It's like it's waiting for me. Margaret's heart clenched. Nathan cursed again, rubbing his face. Okay, all right. Maybe it's just in his head. Maybe it's just a memory, like an afterimage or something. David shook his head immediately. No, it's real. Margaret exhaled shakily, trying to keep herself calm for David's sake. Okay, sweetheart, listen to me. She cupped his small face, forcing him to look at her. You don't have to play anymore. The show is over. You're here with me now. It's over. David's lower lip trembled. What if it's not? Margaret's chest ached. She turned sharply to Nathan. We need to find out what's happening. If the song isn't finished, then we need to finish it. Nathan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Are you hearing yourself? Margaret, what does that even mean? Margaret's voice was firm. I don't know, but I won't sit here and wait for something to come back for him. David flinched slightly at that, and Margaret immediately softened her tone, brushing his hair back. I won't let anything happen to you, she whispered. Nathan exhaled heavily, shaking his head. And how exactly do we stop something we don't even understand? Margaret hesitated. And then, David whispered, the theater. Margaret's stomach dropped. Nathan groaned. Oh, hell no. David looked up at her, his small hands clenching in her coat. Mom, I think I have to go back. Margaret shook her head instantly, her entire body tensing. No, absolutely not. David's gaze didn't waver. I feel it, Mom. I feel it pulling me. His voice was small, frightened. If I don't go back, I think it'll come for me anyway. Margaret's vision blurred. She turned to Nathan. We're going. Nathan threw his hands up. Of course we are, he muttered. Why would we not go running straight into the horror show? Margaret ignored him, already reaching for her coat, already moving before her fear could paralyze her. David reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, and she held on just as hard. The drive back to the theater was silent. Margaret's fingers clenched the steering wheel, her pulse pounding in her ears. Nathan sat beside her, his jaw tight, his hands tapping anxiously against his knee. In the back seat, David stared out the window, his small hands folded in his lap. He hadn't spoken since they left. Margaret stole a glance at him in the rearview mirror. Sweetheart, are you okay? David hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'm scared. Margaret's chest ached. I know, baby, she whispered, but I'm right here. David's fingers curled against his sleeves. Will it hurt? Margaret swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. Nothing is going to happen to you, she promised. Not while I'm here. David didn't respond, but she saw his small shoulders rise and fall with a shaky breath. She wanted to pull over, wanted to wrap him in her arms and tell him they didn't have to do this, that it would all go away on its own, that he was safe. But she couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. The past wasn't done with them yet. The theater loomed ahead, dark and silent, the broken marquee barely visible in the dim streetlights. Margaret parked the car, swallowing against the suffocating dread building in her throat. Nathan exhaled sharply. Well, back to hell we go. Margaret turned in her seat, reaching for David's hand. "Are you sure?" David hesitated, but then he nodded. Margaret took a deep breath, and they stepped out of the car. The doors to the theater were unlocked. Margaret didn't know whether that terrified her more or less. The air inside was thick, still heavy with the weight of something unseen. The remnants of the past lingered in every shadow, in every breath. The silence was loud, almost too loud. David's grip on her hand tightened, and then the stage lit up. Margaret gasped. Nathan cursed under his breath. The chandeliers above flickered, their golden glow illuminating the dust-filled air. The stage, the place where everything had ended, where it had all begun, stood empty, waiting. David took a shaky step forward. Margaret held him back. "Wait!" But he was already looking at something. Margaret followed his gaze, and her blood ran cold. At the edge of the stage, the piano. It hadn't been there before. Margaret's entire body went rigid. David took another step, his breath hitching. "I have to play it." Margaret's grip tightened. "No, David." David turned to her, his brown eyes filled with something old. "Mom, I think this is the last note." Margaret's heart pounded. "David, please." David looked at the piano and whispered, "I have to finish it." Margaret's breath stopped. David climbed onto the stage. Margaret rushed forward, but Nathan caught her, holding her back. "Margaret, wait." David sat at the piano. His small fingers hovered over the keys. The air vibrated, and then he pressed a single note. The last note. The world shattered. Margaret screamed. The chandeliers exploded. The stage collapsed. The sound. Oh God, the sound. And then, silence. Margaret gasped, her eyes flying open. The theater was gone. She was standing in the middle of an empty lot. No stage. No chandeliers. No piano. Just nothing. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Nathan stood beside her, wide-eyed. And David stood in front of her, breathing, alive. His small hand reached for hers. Margaret broke. She fell to her knees, pulling him into her arms, sobbing into his hair. David clung to her. The music was gone. The past had released them, and this time, it was truly over, or so they thought.